Right now, though, very pleased to have with us Dr. Kyle Scott, who teaches American politics and constitutional law at Duke University and the University of Houston. Dr. Scott, good evening, sir.
Hey, good evening to you. Thanks for having me back.
You bet. A real pleasure talking to you again, and enjoyed your piece in the Washington Times. Gun crimes don't happen because of weak laws, and you hit on something that we talk about all the time here on this program. Gun control targets the wrong people.
Sure, it absolutely does. I mean, it's almost turned into a cliche, but you outlaw the guns and only the criminals have them. What I've tried to do, though, in developing this argument is develop what I would consider a third defense for gun rights, one that doesn't already have ready-made objections to it by gun rights opponents.
Okay. Can you elaborate for us?
Sure, absolutely. We all understand the practical argument and the practical benefit of owning guns and the right to bear arms. The other side is aware of those arguments and has their own set of ready-made arguments as well, and therefore they're not willing to, neither side is really to have a dialogue along those things because everyone's sort of trenched into their argument because arguments are so familiar. And on the constitutional side, while you can make a strong constitutional case, in fact, probably an irrefutable constitutional case for the right to keep and bear arms, once you place your sole rights within the body of the Constitution, you're in effect turning it over to the government, which then can at times make constitutionally erroneous or unconstitutional opinions, and then you're not left with a whole lot. So what I'd like to do is just sort of add the third level of argument and sort of question a more, fundamental defense of rights in general and gun laws in particular, and what's the role of laws in society in general.
Okay.
And so the general argument is simply that laws in and of themselves don't change a character of a people. They don't necessarily control our behavior unless we're already predisposed to sort of following rules or respect natural hierarchy. So to just continually pass laws doesn't have much effect if you're already sort of disposed to or willing to break laws.
You know, I think that's exactly right. And, you see this in places like Chicago, Illinois, or Washington, D.C., or Camden, New Jersey, or probably a lot of other places around the country as well. I mean, every night on this program, we have a segment called the deal of the day, the plea deal of the day, where we look at these career criminals. Sometimes, these guys have more arrests than years that they've been on this earth, and yet you see a record of slap on the wrist, charges dropped, a case dismissed, null prost, and what happens, as that goes on, and we're not just talking about one individual, we're talking about this across the criminal justice system with thousands of individuals. Why wouldn't they lose respect for the law? Why wouldn't they have the attitude of, well, if I break the law, chances are I'm not going to get caught, and even if I do get caught, I'm going to get a plea bargain and I'm going to be out soon?
Sure, absolutely. You have that aspect of it as well. But, when I pose this argument, I say the reason why I don't murder people or the reason I'm not a kidnapper isn't because the law tells me it's wrong. It's because there's a conscience that's been cultivated or that's been crafted through my upbringing that the law really has nothing to do with.
Yeah.
And so whatever weapon I have at my disposal, I'm not going to use it in an unjustified fashion. So it's not the law that's telling me, although it does tell me that I shouldn't do those things. That's not the reason I don't do those things.
Right. No, exactly right. Because you've got that. It's not the law that gives you that moral sense of right and wrong. The law sort of buttresses that moral sense of right and wrong.
Sure. If anything, the law should be a reflection of a community's or an individual's values and not sort of superimpose its own independent set of values upon the individual.
Okay. Now, you say that that this argument doesn't have a ready response from the gun control crowd. And I'll be honest with you, Dr. Scott, I mean, I've tried to think about playing devil's advocate, and honestly, the best argument that I can come up with is the one that we hear all the time from the gun control advocates. But, Dr. Scott, we have to do something.
You're right. We do have to do something, but we also have to recognize that doing something for the sake of doing something won't solve the problem. just getting out there to pass laws instead of simply, I would suggest to borrow that, fiddling while Rome burns. There's other ways to address the problem. If you just simply piddle at the margins, you'll continue to cover up or ignore what the essential problem is. And the essential problem, as I see it within all crime or whatever the case may be, is that people lack a certain moral compass, those people who are willing to commit certain crimes, and no law can correct that.
Absolutely. In fact, but that doesn't mean that the problem can't be corrected, but it just means that passing additional gun control legislation is not the way to go.
Sure, and I'm also not taking, a laws are useless approach either.
Right.
I mean, there's certainly value to laws, but to see them as the sole manner of correcting behavior is just, I think it's misguided.
So, Dr. Scott, I mean, where do you see the gun control debate going? Clearly, the usual suspects are out there. They're continuing to push for more gun control laws. Do you think that they're going to get any traction? And quite frankly, at this point, it's not just that it's counterproductive or a waste of time. There are communities that could actually be recovering from this violence if some of these anti-gun advocates would simply be willing to take a fresh look at what actually works.
Absolutely. So you're right into saying that people ought to look at what actually works, although I'm not as optimistic that people will.
Well, no.
But at the same side, we tend to focus almost exclusively this time of year every 4 years at the importance of the presidential election. And I think what people need to recognize is that not all issues are exclusively within the national domain, and look for ways to get involved and to promote what they think is valuable within their more local and state-run elections, because that's where these types of laws begin to creep in. So if you really want to have an impact, because your vote counts more, the dollar you donate matters more to that local city official, and you'll have a greater impact there than you would voting for a president. Not to say that that's not an important election, but you can have a far greater impact and influence at the local level.
Absolutely right. Talking with Dr. Kyle Scott from Duke University and the University of Houston. And Dr. Scott, do you see this? Is this debate going to continue along the same path? I know you said that you're not particularly enthusiastic that anti-gunners are going to, take a fresh look at what works. Is the media going to continue to do what they're doing? Is anybody interested, other than perhaps gun owners and a few academics, a few researchers, law enforcement, and maybe some politicians? Is anybody interested in actually changing things and changing this dynamic?
At the moment, I think if you are interested in changing the dynamic in a direction of greater rights and protection of gun rights, now is the most opportune time to do it, given that the focus tends to be on international affairs, the economy, and when it comes to domestic issues, it has to do with reproductive rights and not necessarily this gun-related issue. As we saw in recent shootings, it's almost as though discussion of gun laws were in the news for about a day, then disappeared. So if you would really like to make inroads into expanding the right of gun owners, now would be the best time to do it while the other side's looking the other way.
All right. Now, one final question for you. I kind of like that attitude, Dr. Scott. On the college campuses where you teach, what's the attitude among the students? I'm guessing among the faculty, still largely anti-gun, but is the student body starting to change their mind when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms?
It depends on where you are.
Yeah.
In Houston, being in the deep in the heart of Texas here, it's more open to that sort of idea. But at a place like Duke, where a lot of students are coming from the Northeast and not necessarily from the South, then there is greater opposition to it. Really breaking along lines how you would expect them to break down.
Right. Well, Dr. Scott, again, I really appreciate you coming on the program, sir. Have a great weekend, and hope we can do this again very soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.